Greetings and salutations, and thank you for clicking on this video. It's time for another EzeeLinux Q&A episode, and this is number 12. This is your questions and my answers, and the questions come from YouTube comments. They also come from EzeeLinux on the web and EzeeLinux on Facebook, and I am going to read some questions and answer them. Can't believe we've done 12 of these so far. So let's jump right in and get started. First question. Have an HP laptop with 1 terabyte SSD, has Windows 10 installed. Want to get rid of Windows 10 and install Linux Mint 18.2 onto SSD. There is a lot of talk about optimizing SSD for Linux. Do you have a tutorial I can print out and follow to do this right and not kill the SSD or cause it to die out prematurely? And the question comes to us from Tom Tamplin. Answer. You don't have to do anything to take care of your SSD with Linux Mint 18.2. It will all be done automatically. You don't even have to worry about it. When you install Linux Mint 18.2 or Ubuntu 16.04 and up, it detects that you have an SSD. It partitions the SSD properly, and then it sets up a job that runs once a week that will actually run trim. So the SSD is being taken care of without you having to do anything. This automatic feature has been around since Ubuntu 14.04. The original 14.04 version did have a caveat where it would only work on certain models of SSD unless you went in and edited a configuration file and told it specifically not to check for the model. As of Ubuntu 16.04, which Linux Mint 18.2 is based on, it works with every SSD and you don't have to do anything about it. Yes, there is a lot of talk about optimizing SSD for Linux. A lot of that is out of date. Early on, you would have to go in and actually edit some configuration files to get Linux to do trim and things like that. Now you don't have to do that. That has all been taken care of and it's pretty much automatic. In Arch Linux, for instance, the only thing that you have to do for SSD is to enable the trim job to run once a week, and that's done through systemd. And most Linux distributions have a way of dealing with this. So in Ubuntu, you don't have to worry about it at all. It's already set up. So a lot of that information just doesn't apply. Now, as far as killing an SSD is concerned, I know that I, in the past, have actually posted videos where I've complained about SSDs. I've killed about 3 of them. But I am not a typical user. I tend to move hard drives around a lot, and I end up reformatting them. I do all kinds of goofy stuff with my hard drives that a lot of people won't do. If you just have a computer with a terabyte SSD in it, and you just install it and let it run, it'll take care of itself. SSDs these days are just as reliable as spinning drives, maybe even more. And all this stuff about conserving rights and everything, the file system will take care of that. It'll do it for you. And some of that is just paranoia at this point. Like there are people who say you shouldn't put a swap partition on an SSD. It doesn't matter. It makes no difference. Most computers these days don't use a whole lot of swap to begin with. The swap partition is there mainly for emergencies, and even if it does use it every now and again, it's not going to trash your SSD. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just install Linux Mint 18.2 and enjoy it. That's all you have to do. This is something that worries me a lot. What do you think? Ubuntu is now available in the Windows 10 App Store. This is a question that comes to us from Elias. This is something that I really haven't commented on very much. Just before Canonical released Ubuntu 16.04, it was announced that they would be working with Microsoft to make Ubuntu available as a feature on Windows 10. And now it has appeared in the App Store, and you can actually just go get it, and then you will install it on a Windows 10 machine without having to finagle anything to make it work. Now, what you're actually getting is just a terminal. That's all it is. It's an application that opens up a terminal, and you have Bash running, which is the shell, and then under that you have the Ubuntu base system. That's it. And I guess this would be useful for people who are administering a lot of servers. Most of the internet runs on Linux these days, so therefore that might be attractive to somebody who wants to have Windows 10 as their main desktop. So you don't have to install a third-party application like PuTTY to be able to use SSH. Maybe developers out there need the tools that are available in Ubuntu. There are great development tools in there, so this is why they're doing this. Canonical has never satisfactorily answered the question why they were doing this. I have never heard anything from them that explained what their thinking was. And the timing of this project was highly suspect because it was just before 1604 was released. And then 1604, when it first came along, had a lot of bugs in it. So some people criticized them and said, well, if you wouldn't have been messing around with Microsoft's crap, you might have come up with a version that didn't have so many bugs. I mean, I have heard all of this stuff go on. I think mainly that Canonical looks at it as advertising. Because if Ubuntu is in the Windows App Store, somebody might see that and wonder what it is, and they might want to try it and play with it, and then after a while, running Ubuntu within Windows 10 doesn't sound like an attractive option for me anyway, since Windows 10 is essentially a dumpster fire of an operating system, and the IT world is not very happy with Windows 10 as is. So therefore, I think that would probably might move some people away from Windows. They would actually start using Ubuntu in a terminal, and then they might actually want to just run it somewhere. But the thing is that anybody who would be attracted to running Ubuntu in a terminal on Windows 10 would already probably be somebody who didn't really want to be running Windows 10, because if you have that level of expertise anyway, you'd probably just install Ubuntu. So the whole thing doesn't make a bunch of sense to me. I think the reason why Microsoft wanted to do this was because they are feeling a lot of heat from Linux in the enterprise sector. Don't worry about consumer desktops. I know that you can walk into any store anywhere, especially in the US, and buy a computer, and chances are it'll be loaded with Windows 10 if you don't buy a Mac. I know that. But Microsoft doesn't make a whole lot of money on that market, and they never have. They make their money in enterprise. And Microsoft is feeling a pinch in the enterprise sector from Linux and BSD Unix, and a lot of people are looking for alternatives to do things. And in the last few years, they've come along and they've said, oh, we love Linux. They've ported a lot of major stuff to Linux, their platforms and whatnot. And so therefore, I think they're doing that because they feel like they have to. They have to be seen as participating in this enterprise Linux community. If they don't, then they're really going to be left behind. But my personal opinion is they're going to be left behind anyway. And that's because most of the enterprise users that are currently using Windows are actually not using 10. They're using 7. A lot of big companies, government agencies, that's as far as they've gone. They've not upgraded past that. Windows 8 and Windows 10, from an IT person's perspective, it's just, they have so much crap running on top of it, especially Windows 10. They have ad servers that run. They have all of these different little things that report back everything that you do. Enterprise people don't like this. Even when you go through and try and turn all that stuff off, guess what? It still works. That's been proven. People have sniffed Windows 10 even after you've gone in and turned everything off, and this is supposed to be Windows 10 Enterprise and you've paid a lot of money for it. Guess what? It still phones home. A lot of IT people just don't like that, folks, and they're not willing to move on to this platform. I would not be surprised if within a few months or so we didn't see Microsoft actually offering a Linux distribution of their own. I know that sounds crazy. I've actually been saying this for a couple years now. I think somewhere down the road, if they want to survive as a company, they're actually going to have to start participating in the open source world. And I would not be surprised to see something like MS Linux come along, which would be a Linux distribution from Microsoft. Really, honestly, I know that sounds crazy, but if they want to survive, they're going to have to start working with the Linux community. The consumer market is something different. The numbers that are reported at this point say that Linux has 2-point-something% of the desktop market share. However, when people quote those numbers to me, I just sort of laugh. And the reason why is because the way that information is gathered is highly suspect. Canonical did a bunch of papers on that a couple of years ago, and they said that the numbers don't quite match up. So therefore, I'm kind of leery of quoting those numbers myself. But if you look at those numbers, you'll see that a lot of people are still using Windows 7, maybe Windows 8. A lot of folks are reluctant to move to 10. 10 has really been, it's just a really bad system, ladies and gentlemen. And I know that I don't like Windows at all, and I don't like Microsoft, so therefore take that into account. That's my opinion. But I think that Microsoft is going to have to move and change with what's going on in enterprise, or they're just going to die. They've already laid off a bunch of people not too long ago, so this is why we're seeing this. So let's move on to another question before I get more Windows fanboys mad at me. Okay, no, we'll get to the terminal in just a second. I want to switch the slide, please. Thank you. The su superuser command in Linux Mint 18.2 is turned off by default. If you try to use it, you'll get a response like this after entering your password. Su authentication failure. Why? And this comes to us from Kenny. Yes, you're absolutely correct. It does not work. And the reason why it does not work is because the root account in Ubuntu-based systems is disabled. It is locked, and it doesn't actually work. So if you would type su, which would be the switch user or super user command, then you type in your password. That's for your account. It's not for the root account. There's no password assigned to a disabled root account. It would say authentication failure. And that's why it doesn't work. In Ubuntu, the root account is locked for security reasons. A lot of hacks out there that would try and get into your computer, what they want to do is they want to gain super user privileges. They want to run as root. They want to hack into the root account. If the root account is disabled and not working to begin with, that makes that a little bit more difficult, and it gives you a bit more security. So how do we act as the super user in Ubuntu? Now we can switch to the terminal, and I will show you. So what you probably are already familiar with is that if you want to run a command that needs root privileges or super user privileges, we use sudo. All right, so let's do one. Sudo apt update. Ask for your password, and then off you go. Now, the sudo command, what it does is it looks to see whether the user who is asking for this permission actually has permission to do this. And if they do, and your password matches up the sudo list, guess what? You get to do it. And you can run as root. And I see we have a couple of upgrades that need to get run. To run as a super user in an Ubuntu-based system, what you would do is you would issue sudo, and then you would just say -s. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to open up a sub shell. That S is for shell. And what we're going to do here now is I'm going to hit enter, and you notice it didn't ask for a password because I just put it in. There's also a timer on the sudo command, so if you put your password in once and then you use the sudo command again within a certain period of time, it doesn't ask. But then if you walk away and leave it alone for a couple minutes, it'll switch back and ask again. Anyway, now we are logged in as root. Now remember, the root account is disabled. We're acting as root. But for all intents and purposes, we can do everything that the root user does. So this time around, we can run the same command, and we will not have to add sudo to the beginning of it. We're just running as the root user. And this is very convenient if you're going to be doing things on the system that need root privileges. You're going to be doing a lot of things, you know, one right after the other. If you're editing a bunch of configuration files or something like that, this is a convenient thing to have. It's also very dangerous. So for those of you who are new to Linux and you're seeing this and you go, oh, well, that's cool. When you log in as the root user on any Linux system, you have complete control over that computer. And if you don't know what you're doing, or you mistype your command, and then you execute that command, first of all, the system will not prompt you and say, do you really want to do this? Because it assumes, since you are running as root, that you know what you're doing. And you could very easily wipe out configuration files. You could wipe out all of your data. There's a lot of things that you can do as root that would really trash the system. So if you're going to do this, proceed with extreme caution. There are certain commands that you would use as a standard user that you would be prompted, you can't do this, or do you really want to do this, that as root you won't. It'll just take your word for it, and it'll just do it, and it'll trash the system. It can happen. I've done it myself. I don't think there's a long there's a long-time Linux user anywhere on the planet that didn't log in as root and do something really, really stupid and destroy their computer. When you're done, you type exit, and that takes you back to being a standard user. You can activate the root account on an Ubuntu-based system. And you would do that by giving the root account a password. So to do that, it would be sudo passwd, which is the password command, and then you would hit enter. You would give it your password, and then you would create a new password for the root account. Now you have an activated root account, and SU will work. Don't do it. There's no reason to do it. You have sudo s, you can act as the root user. You do not need to activate the root account. It just makes it a little bit less secure. Older Linux distributions, some of them require that you activate the root account at install. But nowadays, if you just do not give the root user a password, and then you make the user account that you create for yourself, put that as an administrator, you have exactly the same effect that you do in Ubuntu by default. In other words, the root account is not activated, but you are the administrator, so you can do that. For instance, on Red Hat, CentOS, Fedora type systems, what happens is that if you're an administrator, you're put into a group called Wheel. The Wheel group has administrative access to sudo. So you don't have to activate the root account. As long as the user that you want to have administrative privileges is a member of this group called Wheel, you're good to go. You can use sudo just exactly as we're using it here. So there you go, gang. That's the answer to that question. I hope that helps, Kenny. A lot of people who come to new Linux from old Linux, especially if they're moving from like an old Red Hat system that they might have used years ago or something like that, they'll run into the changes that have happened in Ubuntu, and they'll get a bit confused like that. Partitions for Linux Mint. What's the best way to install Linux Mint 18.2? Separate partitions, home, root, swap, or the installer's way with a single partition? And this question comes to us from Craig, and I get asked this a lot. These days, with the way Linux Mint works and the way Ubuntu works, they have in-place upgrades. So if this is a system that you just plan to use and you're not going to be doing anything goofy with it, like swapping drives in and out, you're not going to be wanting to move data around or do in-place reinstalls, that sort of thing, just letting the manual, or rather the automatic installer do its thing is perfectly okay. If you're installing on a system that has UEFI enabled, you are going to have a special UEFI bootloading partition put up front, and therefore it's probably better to let the automatic installer take care of that and not fool around with the partitions. Let's look a little bit deeper into this. I'm going to try and not get too complicated here. I just want to really kind of go over this. So I have a couple of partition schemes laid out here for us to talk about, and the numbers here don't match up, folks. They don't make mathematical sense. It's just I was just putting stuff in to do this little presentation, so don't try and make it make sense, okay? So what the installer does automatically is it looks for the first hard drive in the computer. This would be SATA 0. That's the first actual hard drive that is hooked up, and it will consider that to be the drive where the system should live. And it will offer to do several things with that drive. If there's already another operating system on it, it'll try and set up a dual boot. If you want to start from scratch, it will offer to erase and install. I think erase and install is always the better way to go. Anytime you're trying to set up a dual boot or do anything like that, you might run into problems later. So if you're a newbie, you're brand new, just wipe the system and start over. Make sure you back up all your data or anything that you want off the computer, of course, but that's should be pretty obvious because it will blank the hard drive. It's going to create just a whole new partition table on that drive and convert it over to Linux-friendly partitions. So if it's already got Windows on it or something like that, it all goes away. So when it finds that first drive, it assigns it the letter A. So that's why it's called dev SDA. And in this case, we're dealing with a 1 terabyte drive. The usable space on a 1 terabyte drive would be about 951 gigabytes or something like that. So that's why I put it here. And then you have the first partition on that drive, which would become SDA1, that's going to be your root partition. Now, that partition is going to contain everything. It's going to have your home folder in there with all of your user data. It's going to have the boot partition, or rather the boot folder in it. In that partition, it's going to be there. Everything's going to be in one big happy partition. And then at the end of the drive, it's going to set aside some space, and it's going to create a swap partition, which will be slightly bigger than the amount of installed memory you have in the computer. That is the accepted swap setup for Ubuntu and Linux Mint and many other distributions of Linux as well. And what it will do if you are running a system that does not have UEFI enabled, so you're using MS-DOS NBR for your partition table, is it will create a logical partition, and then it will put the swap partition in there, which is why that swap partition is called SDA5, because with a logical partition, the numbering always starts at 5 and goes up. So that's how that works. If you're new to Linux, you're not going to do a great deal with the system, you don't plan to do like all kinds of sexy things with it, let the installer do it automatically. It's perfectly all right. If you're running an SSD, let it install it automatically. No big deal. Now, usually what I do when I install systems is, and that's because I'm always doing goofy stuff with it. I'm always moving drives around and trying different things and playing with partitions. It's just me. What I do is set up a real basic manual partition like this. So what I'll do is I will give SDA1, which is the first partition, I will create that and give it 50 gigabytes, and that's where I will put the system. So that's why you see the slash or the root there. That's where the operating system lives. And then I will create a home partition, which is pretty much most of the drive, and that will be a primary partition. It'll be partition 2. And that's where all of the user data lives. So everything that's in the home folder appears in that partition. And then at the end of the drive, I'll put a swap partition there. And once again, I'll make it a little bit bigger than the installed memory on the computer. And I also do that as a primary partition. I don't create any logical partitions. I just go ahead and put 3 primaries. And if I actually did want to move things around on that drive, I can always create a logical partition as 4, and then all of the logical volumes within there would be 5. So that's how I do it when I set up a system. But nowadays, you know, unless you're really going to be moving stuff around, they have all this in-place upgrade for Ubuntu. They also have it for Linux Mint. You can upgrade from one version to the next and just keep on chugging, and it works just fine. And it's gotten to the point where it's so good at that the old adage of, well, have a separate home partition so you can reinstall the system and all that stuff, you really don't have to do that. It's done in place. Besides, if you open up the installer and you tell it to use the root partition, and then you tell the system not to format that partition at the installer, it does exactly the same thing as reinstalling in a separate root partition from home. It just leaves your home folder alone, and it reinstalls the system in there. So yeah, that's how we do it these days. So thanks for your question. Just for the sake of simplicity, I always just tell people these days, just go ahead and use the automatic installer. Let it make the decisions, especially if you're using an SSD, because then it figures out it's an SSD and it aligns the partitions. We talked about that in the early part of the video. So just use the automatic these days. Selling Linux. If Linux is free, why is it being sold on Amazon? I've always wondered if these sellers are selling corrupt, hackable software that also spreads silent viruses, and this comes from Mrs. Clippit. That was the name of the person who asked the question. Okay, let's talk about this a little bit. Yes, you can go on Amazon and you can buy USB sticks and DVDs that have Linux distributions on them, especially for Linux Mint and Ubuntu. You see a lot of that. And basically what people are doing is simply creating the media and then selling the media. They're not selling the system. Linux itself is open source and it's freely distributable. So yes, you can take Linux Mint and you can create a bunch of DVDs or USB sticks, and then you can sell them and you can charge for them, and it's no problem. They're not infringing any licenses. However, I kind of agree here that some of those sellers, that might be a little bit suspect, because that means they've had access to that ISO image And they may put something in there. This is true. And a lot of people that I have worked with through EzeeLinux over the last few years have bought these things and then tried to use them and they don't work, or they've had major issues with them. And then I end up going, okay, you're going to have to create your own. Here's how to do it. So I personally would never buy one of these things unless it came directly from Ubuntu or Linux Mint. So if Linux Mint is selling you a DVD or a USB stick and you are recommended where to go to get it on their site, that's an entirely different story. But just an independent seller somewhere on Amazon and you don't know who this person is and you don't know what they've done with it, I would be very wary of that. It's just too easy to create installer media anyway. All the major operating systems have the tools either built in or readily available to burn a DVD or create a USB stick anyway. And it's just, you know, get used to doing it that way if you're going to be playing around with Linux, because I always say that Linux is like potato chips. You can't have just one anyway. You'll probably be trying different distributions, loading up your computers, your friends' computers, your mom's computer anyway. So learn how to create the images. Don't rely on buying a DVD. Those days are pretty much gone anyway. Okay, that's all I have for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Your feedback is always welcome. Please be sure to give EzeeLinux a like on Facebook. Thanks for that. Also, check out EzeeLinux on the web, and check out freedompenguin.com for more information about Linux. And this exact text will be in the description to this video, and you can use that to link directly to all those different web pages. Thank you so much for watching. I certainly do appreciate it. We will do it again soon.